I'm on this site right now, SmirnoffDrops.com. This is awesome. They have some truly unique, incredible items that you can get handpicked by a bunch of different celebrities, including Super Bowl champ Vernon Davis, for just $12.99, just like a bottle of Smirnoff. You guys know I love Smirnoff because they're an official vodka partner of the NFL, of the Super Bowl, of my show, and you don't need to break the bank. That's what's so Smirnoff extraordinary about it. Check out all these items they have. Knowing Jack, my producer, will be all over some of these for $12.99. SmirnoffDrops.com. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, sold from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company here in New York, pricing at the sole discretion of the retailer. May vary by state. Please not share with anyone under legal drinking age.
It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings. DraftKings, the crown is yours. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years. Long time ago now, nobody cares. What you do care about is I've got the best fantasy analyst in the game, John Daigle, from EstablishTheRun.com, where you can use that code FEAST to get a discount and get a jump on the 2025 season. Why wouldn't you? Sign up now when you can get the information for the entire year moving forward, which you will love to get. You can check him out on social media at NotJDaigle. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. Always appreciate those of you that take advantage of any of our sponsors or rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's huge. Or check us out, youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL, which is always growing. Last week we focused on the Super Bowl prop bet recap. This week, we're going to spin it forward now. And there will be other weeks where we'll talk a little bit more about lessons we learned from the season that was, and there's all kinds of stuff we're going to get into. But the newsiest stuff going on right now is coaching changes around the NFL. We now officially know that Kellen Moore will be the head coach of the New Orleans Saints, but there's still some coordinator movement. For example, the Philadelphia Eagles still need an offensive coordinator. They have yet to name one. So we're going to go through the NFC this week. Next week, we'll probably hit up the AFC. And I guess my first question, John, you've been doing this a long time now. You've had a lot of success. How important do you think for your fantasy teams that offensive coordinator in particular, how important that is and how much stock you put into that when you're making your drafting decisions?
In terms of finding sleepers, I think understanding where new coaches are coming from, what tree they learn from, their approach is very important, because that's what's going to identify the gems in the later rounds that those in our leagues can't see. Typically for fantasy, we're really just all trying to follow the Gary Kubiak coaching tree. And that, of course, trickled down to Kyle Shanahan, which then trickled down to Sean McVay and expanding Kubiak's playbook as well, with pre-snap motion, a lot more play action, and wide zone concepts. And then we've seen since that time, the Shanahan and McVay trees lead to their own successes. And Kevin O'Connell, Mike McDaniel, we have a couple other guys who we'll talk about today in terms of the coaching changes for the NFC that I do think also could not only create their own tree if everything goes well, but really just carry on that torch that we try to look for when it comes to fantasy players. So I used to write a lot about usage and it carrying over from year to year with certain coaches. But what I found out later on, after you've done this for so long, Evan Silva and everyone at ETR knows this as well, is that really it's not necessarily the target rate to wide receivers or head coaches use their tight ends identically every place they go. All good coaches do is identify the talent they have in their personnel and then change up their scheme to match that personnel and get the ball to those talented players. And so we'll talk about some of those situations as we move on and discuss the NFC here as well.
And I'll point out that a couple things. One is, I would argue that Gary Kubiak's tree starts with Mike Shanahan on top of him. And then I'm sure you could say Mike Shanahan's tree starts with Bill Walsh or whatever, right? Like, everybody has a tree. But certainly, the Denver Broncos really took the NFL by storm in the mid-'90s with those back-to-back Super Bowl championships when they were running roughshod with Terrell Davis with the outside zone scheme and having a tremendous amount of success doing so. So I think you're right about that particular coaching tree. It's wild. I mean, we'll get to the AFC next week, but even Nick Caley, I mean, if you are on the Rams coaching staff, or to a little bit of a lesser extent the Niners coaching staff, or maybe not even, those are the staffs where they're getting guys. I mean, for the most part, those position coaches are being promoted to being coordinators. Those coordinators are getting head coaching jobs. I mean, those are the organizations you certainly want to be in right now, the Rams and the Niners, and probably deservingly so. I would also say, with every passing year, I really do think that coaching is more and more important. I really do. I really do think that, you almost don't want to think that when you're a player, but then you look back on it and you're like, man, we were not being put in the best position all the time. And I can think of that from college. I can think of that from the NFL. Even just, John, I had 9 different offensive line coaches, 9 different head coaches, which I'm assuming means I had 9 different offensive coordinators. And there's no question that some were significantly better than others. And you could kind of feel it at times. It's not all just talent driven. So I do think that this is a big deal and makes a big difference. No question.
I would also argue it helps out receivers the most because targets are still earned, and where those targets are earned mattered a lot for fantasy. Whereas running backs still line up and do a lot of different things, but they get the ball. By literally just being in the game, you can get the ball. If you were in the game as a wide receiver, you necessarily do not get the ball. So how you're being schemed to run your routes and how close to the line of scrimmage you're being used, all these things matter for fantasy and lead to more fantasy points.
Let's dive into some of these now, which I think is really interesting. I think the most notable one is in Chicago, where they have hired Ben Johnson as their head coach. He will be the play caller as well in Chicago. And I think we all noticed, John, how creative he was and how productive he was. So he always had some of the trick plays or getting linemen involved in catching passes or whatever. And also, their offense was a machine. But they also were pretty loaded on offense. When you think about their running backs, their O-line, very good quarterback, their receiving core led by Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I always think that's an interesting thing, too, is to try to separate the play caller from the talent that they had. But obviously, it's hard to not be bullish on Ben Johnson.
And for the Lions offense under Ben Johnson, it's not just the fact that they had talent. A lot of teams have lots of talent. It's the fact that he also made them all serviceable for our purpose, for fantasy. Sam Laporta as a top 12 tight end, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery as weekly starters, Amon-Ra St. Brown as a top 5 wide receiver. The list goes on and on. So it's the fact that he also spread the ball out and used everyone successfully. That's what we're hoping here, even though we have to wait through the draft and free agency to see what the Bears do. Keenan Allen, a pending free agent that they most likely won't bring back to run from the slot. So Ben Johnson is being asked to not only be a head coach, but he's going to be an architect. He's going to take over this organization from the top down. And it's interesting because, as we discussed, trying to target offenses that stem from the Mike Shanahan and Gary Kubiak coaching tree, Ben Johnson is the opposite. Prior to working with the Lions and Dan Campbell, who Campbell, similar to Nick Sirianni, is a hands-off head coach who implements his culture rather than diving into the weeds in the week-to-week game planning. Johnson had previously only gained experience under failed coaches in Joe Philbin, Matt Patricia, and Adam Gase. If it all works out, given that this is going to be Johnson's coaching tree, then we could be looking at the next one that stems down for the next decade. And that includes his current OC, who I don't know if you know, Ross, but 28-year-old, if you want to feel old, 28-year-old Declan Doyle as the Bears OC this year. Has worked in football, though, despite his young age, for a decade. Initially developed a playbook as an offensive assistant at Iowa when he was still going to school in 2016, and he visited the Saints OTAs for a couple of days back then. And although, again, it was a very short stint there, he did get to pepper questions to guys like Sean Payton, Joe Brady, and even Campbell, who was under Payton with New Orleans coaching staff at that time. That curiosity is also how I believe that he not only got the job under Payton in New Orleans in 2019, and then, of course, worked as the Broncos tight ends coach under Payton just last year, but also how he won over Ben Johnson in interviews, because he not only has, Doyle, the experience and the desire to call plays, but more importantly, I think it's because he learned under Pete Carmichael and others in New Orleans how to communicate well with a primary play caller and not step on toes. And so the fact he's going to be not only learning, but also gaining the trust of Ben Johnson and implementing his style whenever Johnson doesn't have the time to put in his approach to that playbook, it's going to be just something fresh and intriguing to watch in Chicago, since Doyle also, of course, had a hand in developing a young quarterback in Bo Nix just last year.
Get cool stuff for doing what you're going to do anyway. Drink beer. With Buy Beer, Get Gear from Labatt, just head to the website, snap a photo of your receipt, and upload it instantly to rack up points for exclusive merch. I love this. Get points for every purchase at any store, bar, or stadium. Any size, any product, anywhere you're buying Labatt. Buy beer, get gear. Go to rewards.labattusa.com to sign up. Do they have any history together, John?
No. Doyle and Johnson do not overlap, as far as I know, because he hasn't worked in Detroit at all.
That's just fascinating, isn't it?
Yes, the way the NFL works, too, as you know, usually everyone has shaken hands from time to time, and because of those hands you shake, that's why you get to tag along. Like, we'll get to Kellen more when we get there, but a lot of coaches just tend to follow their someone they've worked with in the past to the next organization. But this is a fresh start.
You know what? I think that's a great sign for Ben Johnson, and I give him a ton of credit that it wasn't just cronyism. He didn't just go with somebody he knew. He had heard about this guy, or heard good things, or was impressed by him. I think that's super cool, and I would give him a lot of credit for doing that. Any initial thoughts on what it really would mean in terms of the Bears off the jump, having Ben Johnson as the play caller and/or Declan Doyle as the OC?
The fact, and thank you for the pronunciation correction, Declan Doyle, not Declan. The fact that, again, Doyle has experience working with a younger quarterback just last year, and that they are going to have to breed Caleb Williams to correct his mistakes, especially under pressure, Ben Johnson. I do think it's going to be good for the Bears' passing attack, including Cole Kmet, DJ Moore, Romo Dunze actually stepping into a wide receiver 2 role, an every down player, as opposed to playing behind Keenan Allen like he did last year. It's going to be great for those players. But again, we also have to see how they fill out the rest of their roster, because Johnson is going to get everyone involved and definitely try to stack this offense to make life easier for Caleb.
Let's talk about the Detroit Lions, because that's another interesting one as well. That's where Ben Johnson came from. And so it just seems natural to talk about the Lions and their new OC, John Morton.
55-year-old coordinator John Morton with only 1 year of true play calling experience in the NFL. He was an offensive coordinator in USC for some time, but working in the professional football league back in 2017 with the Jets only. Having said that, he has overlapped and been an assistant or a wide receivers coach under some historic names, including Norv Turner, Sean Payton, Jim Harbaugh, John Gruden, Bill Callahan, and even initially overlapping with Dan Campbell as Detroit's senior offensive assistant back in 2022. I think it's a great thing that he is really, yes, he's going to try to expand on what Ben Johnson and the league's best offense did last year. But more importantly, the Lions have someone in place who has overlapped and has experience with Jared Goff, since the Lions offense continues to have to build around making sure Jared Goff is comfortable and having the easiest time possible. And I think that's all Morton is going to be asked to do this year.
It's another interesting move that he did not promote from within. He could have done that. He did have some time, as you referenced, with Morton, with the Lions in 2022 when they were together with the Saints. But that still is, I think, pretty interesting that he brought him in there. And that's two guys, both Ben Johnson and Dan Campbell, both hired guys from the Broncos. That speaks pretty well to Sean Payton, I would say.
I agree. I didn't even connect those two dots, but I agree with you.
I mean, they both could have hired guys from Detroit to be their coordinators, and instead they both hired guys from the Broncos to be their coordinators. That jumps out to me. You know, the next two guys, really three of the next four guys we're going to talk about, John, I know pretty darn well. And we'll start with the Bucs and Josh Gizzard, who is a Yale guy and was there. He was with the Dolphins and Mike McDaniel for a long time. Mm-hmm. I used to talk to him a lot before games, radio or television, and he's worked his way up. He's been doing it for a long time, and now he's the Bucs OC as they promote from within.
And your note is important that he did work under Mike McDaniels as Miami's wide receivers and offensive quality control coach for a few years. So we would imagine he's taking that playbook as well as expanding on what Liam Cohen did, new Jaguars head coach, for the Bucs just last year, because there was nothing wrong with what Cohen did. It allowed Baker Mayfield to post career highs in 4,500 passing yards, 41 touchdown passes, and a 71.5% completion rate. So the fact that this is, again, the coaching trees we were trying to target. McDaniels obviously comes from Kyle Shanahan in San Francisco, who extends from Mike Shanahan and Gary Kubiak. That's exactly what we're looking for here. And you would have to imagine, yes, that Gizzard just continues to build on what Cohen did last year. And the good news is that this is going to, I know it's a new OC, but it's at least still similar play calling for Baker Mayfield, because think about it. Since he entered the league in 2018, Baker Mayfield has had 9 different play callers, including with Gizzard, 5 in his last 4 seasons. So any kind of continuity is great for Baker, building off of a great year.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You know, what was the conversation a year ago about Baker? It was, will he be able to do it without Dave Canales? You know, Dave Canales got a lot of credit for Geno Smith in 2022 and for Baker Mayfield 2023. And the thought was that Canales, I mean, that's basically how he got the head coaching job with the Panthers, is the job he did with Baker Mayfield. Baker was even better last year, John, and he did it without Godwin for like most of the year, without Mike Evans for a bunch of games. It's extremely impressive. I mean, Baker's just a top 10 quarterback now. I mean, he just is. And I think the fact that I know Josh is smart. He's been around some good people. And the fact that Todd Bowles promoted him, you know, a first-time coordinator, first time ever calling plays, he doesn't do that unless Baker Mayfield really thinks the guy's sharp. And you got to think that Bowles asked Baker what he thought about that one. I want to get your thoughts, John, on the Cowboys and their hire of Brian Schottenheimer as head coach. You know, my rookie year, 2001, the best head coach I ever had was a guy named Marty Schottenheimer. And keep in mind, I had 3 guys that all have arguments for being the best coach of all time. Bill Belichick, certainly with all the rings. Joe Gibbs, who I'm a huge proponent of in terms of his resume. Bill Parcells. And yet the coach out of that group that was most impressive to me, just in the way they led, the way they hired, the way they let people manage everything. Every aspect of the operation was Marty Schottenheimer, Brian's dad. You know, it feels like it's been a while since he called plays, and it sounds like he's going to be calling plays, John. Is that right?
Correct. They did hire offensive coordinator Clayton Adams, but Schottenheimer mentioned in his hiring press conference that he's the one who's going to be calling plays.
That's interesting because that's a lot to take on because he hasn't done it in a while, and he's going to be the head coach. But wouldn't be surprised if that was Jerry and Stephen Jones' preference, you know, after the experience they had with Mike McCarthy. You guys know all year I've been telling you about Smirnoff, not only as an official sponsor of the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, but also an official vodka partner of the NFL and Super Bowl 59. The best part about Smirnoff, by far, is that you can get the world's #1 vodka without breaking the bank. Okay, this is key. You don't need to pay a lot of money for expensive vodka. This feeling is what the good folks over at Smirnoff call Smirnoff Extraordinary. Smirnoff, we do game days. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Pricing is at the sole discretion of the retailer and may vary by state. Please do not share with anyone who is under legal drinking age.
It was a very poor process, which I know we've grown accustomed to with the Dallas Cowboys not putting in all their efforts early in the season to getting the best hires that ultimately led to Brian Schottenheimer being hired as head coach. Now, why it took this long at his age to get his first head coaching job, I'm not sure. That's obviously a concern. What I do know is that this offense is still going to revolve and has to revolve around Dak Prescott, regardless of what the fans and the organization want. Because Dak is still making an NFL high $60 million annually through 2027. And my concern for the big picture of this team, beyond Schottenheimer, is that in press conferences, Jerry Jones has said a lot of things, but typically, as he always does, he blames injuries rather than stacking his roster with the best 53 guys, as Bill Parcells would always do when he was working under Jerry Jones until he was finally tired of it. But in blaming injuries, you also don't take into account the fact that the Cowboys weren't great team whenever they were at full strength the first 4 games of the year. They were 2-2 and ranked 18th in yards per play and 28th in red zone possessions per game in that stretch. So I think the focus for Schottenheimer has to be making life easier for Prescott, and that includes going back to play action concepts. Because in 2023, when Dak led the league with 36 touchdown passes, he also ranked 9th in use of play action compared to just 42nd in the league last year under Mike McCarthy. If they can do that and still build around CeeDee Lamb, then this offense at least has a chance to fight weekly.
What are your thoughts, John, on the Saints bringing in Kellen Moore as their head coach? We would assume play caller. Sounds like Doug Nussmeier, as we record this Wednesday morning, is going to be named their OC as well. I'm just curious to get your thoughts. I got to tell you, I thought Kellen had a nice year. I was not blown away by him as the Eagles' offensive coordinator and play caller. I thought there were some questionable moments for sure. Some game plans I didn't love. He did a terrific job, obviously, NFC Championship game and Super Bowl. Like, amazing job. Deserves a ton of credit for that. But there were a bunch of games where the passing game wasn't really that good. And then not only that, but their offense was essentially, John, Saquon for nothing, Saquon for nothing, Saquon for 80. You know, we had 400 yards of offense. So, I don't know. I mean, I think he's good, but I'm not going to go ahead and say that he's I don't think it's a gigantic loss, to put it that way.
As you mentioned, poaching Eagles quarterbacks coach, former quarterback coach, Nussmeier to go along with them, and those two have actually worked side by side going all the way back to 2018. Overlapping with the Dallas Cowboys and Chargers as well. In the past in Dallas and LA, to answer your question, the knock against Moore's offenses, and it was a correct one, was that his offense would always sputter in the second half of the season because as opponents gained more film over his play calling, they were quick to adjust, and he could not adjust to them. What I think he learned, in particular in Philadelphia, And this is when you ask their offensive line, their players, like what they're going to miss most about Kellen Moore this upcoming year. It's that he didn't have an ego. He actually listened to the players and implemented play calls whenever they wanted him to without even asking why, because he believed in his players. That was not a case of the past. And so I'm hoping he learned from that and he can transition successfully with that into New Orleans. And so do I have faith that they'll be as explosive of an offense as they were in Philadelphia? Probably not. New Orleans doesn't have the talent. They're also looking at quarterback. We don't expect them to start Derek Carr in week 1 of the 2025 season. So beyond that, how Moore is going to build this offense as a whole, I'm with you. I'm open-minded and curious to see what he does.
Lastly, let's talk Seahawks. Klint Kubiak is now up there in Seattle. This one's a little bit more clear, John, in the sense that Mike McDonald, the head coach of Seattle, he's very outspoken that he wants to run the ball more and run the ball better. Very outspoken in that regard. So it makes me wonder a little bit. I mean, they have Geno and some good receivers, yet that's not what – and typically as McDonald's a defensive-minded head coach, it doesn't surprise me.
And this is one I'm actually really excited for. A sleeper candidate for potentially the best offensive coordinator upgrade of the year, moving on from the lone season that Ryan Grubb worked in Seattle under the Seahawks last year. Because remember, when the Saints starting offensive line, Derek Carr, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, when they were all healthy and on the field together, and it was only 2 full games last year. Otherwise, they all missed time sporadically throughout the season. But in those games, at least New Orleans scored 47 and 44 points against the Panthers and Cowboys. I think because of the concepts Kubiak is bringing over, especially if they can get Seattle's offensive line at full strength and make life easier for Geno Smith, who, remember, when kept upright last year, Geno Smith was 7th in yards per attempt from a clean pocket. I think that makes one of my favorite sleepers for fantasy, Jackson Smith-Njigba, who is a dark horse to lead the league in receiving yards, given those concepts that Kubiak flashed when New Orleans' offensive line was fully healthy just last year.
Absolutely love it, man. I got to tell you guys, if you're not going to establishtherun.com and using the code FEAST, you are behind. How many people have the background for every guy that just got named a coordinator? John is like my producer, Jack. He's an absolute ninja. We're lucky to have him. Check him out on social, at Not J Daigle. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcasts on your favorite platform.